I will now ask the outside view. I will ask our guest from India, Uday Bhaskar. First of all, thank you for coming all over from India to this place here in Brussels. Just to introduce Uday to the audience here, right from the beginning, we started as FEPS a very close cooperation with his think tank in India, and he is one of the most prominent fellows of foreign policy of India, and so we are much looking forward hearing from you a bit what sometimes we are not likely to hear. What is the view from outside? What is India looking at Europe with a foreign and security policy? Uday, it's up to you.
Thank you, Ernst. First of all, I'd like to thank FEPS and President of FEPS, Mr. Dalema, for inviting me here. As Ernst said, I've had a long association with FEPS, and I'd also like to recall one of our senior members of the Indian political class, Mr. George Fernandes, whom some of you know, who was one of the original social democrats in India. And to that extent, we share many of your objectives and the ideals, perhaps, that the social democrats stand for. So in the interest of time, because we only have 5 minutes, as Ernst said, I'll focus my initial remarks on this whole question of the EU and soft power, the view from the outside. I mean, I noticed from this panel that perhaps I am the only Asian, if I can take that liberty, saying that in the 10 people who are listed this afternoon. So if I could speak, candidly, and in the interest of what the editor of the journal had said, that we should provoke debate, sir, I thought I would make the following proposition, that if I look from the outside, for me, coming from India, I'm old enough to have lived through the Cold War. And I also studied World War II as part of the evolution of Europe. So the emergence of the EU as an entity was actually quite a phenomenal experience for me. I mean, there was a certain degree of awe and admiration to say that Europe had embarked soon after, shall we say, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. And to me, again, personally, at the heart was the EU, to me, represented the commitment to democracy. I mean, those of you who recall 1960, the Treaty of Rome, etc. And for us, there's a lot of resonance with the idea of democracy. So if I may build on the remarks made by Mr. Dalema this morning in a very insightful speech, my reflection about EU and how it has approached the whole idea of soft power, our professor from Antwerp has already walked us through the Joe Nye kind of formulation about soft power and its elements and what it means. I am disappointed. I wrote many notes and I said in 5 minutes perhaps I can make one statement. And my proposition is that EU as a collective has abdicated in terms of the collective identity, in terms of the ideals, the principles that Rafaela spoke about, in a very normative sense, that I, from the outside, associate with the EU. And in terms of using available tools, available potential, that the whole basket of soft power that I would associate with the EU has either been ignored or EU as a collective is indifferent and has not used what I would call as very, very rich potential and a whole pedigree that we associate with the EU. So in the interest of time, I'll make this my first proposition or formulation, if I may, to say a sense of disappointment that the EU has so much that it could perhaps share, it could perhaps, in a way, I would say, leaven the experience of the 21st century when democracy becomes the objective, in many ways the holy grail for many parts of the world. I mean, if there's one lesson for the end of the Cold War, that picture of Boris Yeltsin standing on the tank, what did I come away with from India? To say that communism had failed. And therefore, you had a completely new chapter. And if I may digress, I often used to my original work is on China. And when I look at the world as the big, clusters, China came out of Tiananmen in 1989. And about 12 to 14 years down the road, China had a sense of purpose about its own values, principles, whatever you associate with China, and how will it use soft power. So what does it do? It invests in the Confucius centers. I mean, I'm actually coming to my last point just now. And I asked myself when I was making notes for this afternoon, saying, what have the intellectuals of EU done, the academics, the analysts? You know, what is your objective as EU? I mean, I know what Germany wants, I know what Britain wants, I know what France wants when I'm sitting in Delhi. I often ask this question, and I remember asking Prime Minister Prodi when he came to India the first time. Ernst knows this conversation. Many of us asked him, saying that we know you as Italy, we know you as ABC, but please tell us in India, what does the EU stand for in strategic terms, etc. And the disappointment continues, you know, barring that little flicker we saw over Iraq. But after that, again, you know, there is a sense that you have made up your mind on the big issues. But this apart, if I could take another minute, Ernst. You know, what is it that I feel that EU can bring to the table now, you know, amongst the many points? Let me pick up from Dalema's speech, you know, where he said that the EU should move from being a global player to a player on the global field. And I want to introduce two other words, that you have the potential to become a more relevant player, and I believe personally that EU has the potential and the pedigree to be a more empathetic player. If you look at the various challenges that the world has to address in the 21st century, I believe that EU is pitching well below its weight for a variety of reasons. And that is where I think, to the extent that we associate all the normative values, I mean the liberal value, the democratic principle, we go back to the origins of Western civilization. Modernity as we know it, I would associate modernity with the European experience, the Reformation, the Industrial Revolution, and all of that. Now, these are issues which I believe are there in the experience of the EU. It is partly civilizational. It's been also melded with what I would call as the experience of modernity. And I believe that these need to be burnished. And that perhaps is the kind of role that a group like FEPS and supporters of the principles of FEPS could play. And it's in that sense I'd make a very strong case to say that you can identify what the EU wants to prioritize. And please share your more informed reflections or narratives on the last 20 years. 9/11 has happened. 9/11 poses a very complex challenge. It led to various actions that need, I think, objective critique. We have not heard the last word on Syria. Libya is still to, in a way, resolve itself, the contradictions of Libya. We haven't heard the EU raise a word, to the best of my knowledge, about Bahrain. I don't know if Bahrain figures in the discourses of, I'm sorry if it has, I apologize. But I'm just saying that we in India, we in Delhi, are looking for what I would call as this alternate view, and also to remind you that you have enormous potential in your own soft power basket, as I called it, and that you perhaps need to bring it out. And please remember that we associate you with democracy, and therefore, whatever experience you have had on democracy, and we said this last time, so I'm repeating it again, the European democracy has moved from the bottom and gone up. Many parts of Asia, particularly India, democracy has come from the top. Please tell us how you have worked on your governance issues and how you have made democracy more meaningful. And I think that is the kind of value, so that you come back to soft power, that you are able to co-opt the other, if you use the Joe Nye phrase, as opposed to coerce. But when you co-opt, do it with that index of integrity, because you can co-opt by various means. You can seduce, you can offer incentives, but that is less than normative. But to co-opt in a Gramscian way, and it's appropriate that Gramsci is also part of the European, shall we say, inheritance, the value, the pure, I would say, weight of the argument, the power of principle. And perhaps European Union has made a Faustian bargain in taking the short-term, sir, the phrase you used, the short-term option, that you have gone with the compulsion of power. Maybe that needs to be revisited internally.